Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer Middenland lore video. The province of Middenland was founded by a tribe of people known as the Teutogens. They're said to be amongst the most fearsome of Sigmar's warriors when he formed the confederacy of human tribes that would go on to form the Empire. The Teutogens had taken over the area of the Drakwold after defeating another tribe known as the Jutons, and they chased them westwards into the marshes of what would become known as the Wasteland. The Jutons at the time, after being defeated, were led by the Fenwolf, and he actually took his people and they went on to found the city of Marienburg. But the Teutogens themselves forged the province of Middenland, but the province of Middenland as we know it today is very different from the province as it was upon its founding. That is because there was another province set up between Nordland, Middenland, and the Westerlands, or what would later become known as the Wastelands, and that province was the province of Drakwold. Now, it's a bit hard to get an idea from the lore I could dig up on where exactly the Drakwold was, but I've highlighted this area here. I think it sort of covered this area, a little bit of all three provinces, and I think it believed its capital was at what is now Karaburg. So I believe that actually highlights the areas that would have been considered the province of Drakwold back in the early days of the Empire. Drakwold itself was founded by the Thuringians, I believe that's how you pronounce it, and they eventually went on to form a fairly successful province, sharing the mystical and dangerous woods of the Drakwold with the province of Middenland and Nordland. And the woods at the time were infested with all sorts of things, from dragons to beastmen to goblins, but they tended to stand together and had good relations between the three provinces, and Westerland to a certain extent as well. However, in the year 1110 of the imperial calendar, the last known count of the Drakwold died. Now, there's conflicting lore as to what exactly the name of the last count of Drakwold was. Some have him listed as Vilna, and some have him listed as Conrad Aldrich, but either way, the last count of Drakwold died in the year 1110 of the imperial calendar. His runefang was handed in to the emperor at the time, who stored it in the vaults. That runefang was known as Beastslayer, presumably named after the amount of beasts that were struck down, or beastmen that were struck down in the Drakwold forest by the elect counts of Drakwold during their time. Now, the Drakwold didn't immediately dissolve upon the loss of its elected counts. It somehow, one imagines, managed to form some sort of governing body within itself and its citizens, but it was a series of disasters, including the Great Plague of 1111 that ravaged the Empire, the Skaven Wars that then preceded that plague, the constant rampaging of the Beastmen over the lands of the Drakwold, eventually rampaged across the remaining settlements of the Drakwold province, and in 1414, what remained of the Drakwold province was absorbed into Middenland and Nordland and Westerland, respectively. Games Workshop itself is a little bit iffy about the lore of Drakwold and has at times even forgotten that Drakwold was a former province itself. I think it was in one of their publications of uniforms and heraldry where they did include lost provinces like Sylvania and Solland, and gave them sort of their flags and their logos and things, but had actually just seemed to have forgotten themselves about Drakwold. So it's a bit overlooked, the Drakwold province, just in terms of Games Workshop handling their own lore, but it did exist, and it formed a large part of now what is regarded as the vast province of Middenland. So here's Middenland as it stands today, stretching all the way from the Wastelands up to the Great Northern Road, forming its border with Nordland, and down to the border of Hochland in the east, and of course the River Reich marking its southern border as well. To the west of the country, we have a very large area in terms of geographical features known as the Midden Moors. Now, this area has large, vast, infertile tracts of hills and wetlands. It's the source of many tributaries that feed into the River Reich. It's said that large pools of water form around these moors, and that the water in these pools is so still, even on windy days, it forms mirrors, almost, it's sort of unmoving mirrors on the ground itself, thus earning its nickname, the Mirror Moors, as it's often colloquially referred to within Middenland. The Mirror Moors, or the Midden Moors, whichever you prefer to call them, has become a bit of a holiday destination for the nobles of Middenland. They often like to go there to fish and to just sort of do outdoorsy activities. It's said to produce the sweetest trout in the Empire. So very nice tasting fish come out of these moors. However, there is a bit of a dark side to them. Come nighttime, the mirrored pools reflect the starry night sky, and it has a very eerie effect. As well as this, there are often strange lights seen on the moors at night. It's actually been said that these lights are the ghosts of fallen Middenland warriors who still wander the moors, not being able to find their way in the afterlife. Slightly north of the Midden Moors, or the colloquially known Mirror Moors, we have the Black Pit. Now, this is an approximation of where I think the Black Pit is. It's just kind of around that area. It's not too far off that marker I've put on the map. But the Black Pit is essentially a sacred site to the forest goblins, who in an effort to long ago flee orc overlords, set up little villages and societies for themselves in the Drakwold forest. But man over the millennia has constantly been encroaching, and indeed around the time of Sigmar, when man started to build bigger and bigger settlements and started cutting down more and more trees and cutting into the forest goblins actually declared, to themselves, declared war on humanity because they were getting very close to this sacred site, which is the Black Pit. Now, the Black Pit is sacred to the forest goblins because they worship the giant spiders that live in the Drakwold. And the Black Pit is the home to the largest spiders in the Warhammer world, it's thought. So they're trying to kill off any humans who get near it. They like to kill off logging parties when they can. But essentially, it's a war, but a war that's never really ramped up. There's never been a huge scale battle in terms of forest goblins taking settlement after settlement after settlement and just raising the entire province. It's never approached that level of threat. So as far as the forest goblins are concerned, they've been waging this war, but the humans in the province are fairly oblivious and just think it's typical goblin raiding and nothing particularly special. But they're just trying to protect their sacred site, the Black Pit. To the southeast of Middenland, we have the Howling Hills. Now, these hills are said to have got their name for when the wind passes through them. It creates this kind of howling sound constantly. And Middenstag, you see in the middle there, has become kind of a fortress town because the Howling Hills are full of like alcoves and caves and sort of places that you can hide. So they've become a kind of den of iniquity for outlaws to rob the busy local roads that are concerned with trade and all sorts of other things that merchants travel often. And these outlaws often ambush them. So the Middenstag was set up to have patrols going around to try and catch these outlaws, but it's very much sort of bandit country, the Howling Hills, and not hugely populated in itself, but there are a lot of big settlements around its edges that the outlaws like to take advantage of, and they often sort of hide out in these Howling Hills to avoid the justice of Boris Todbringer. To the north of the province, we have, now I'm going to massacre this name, but Schadensumpf. That's the best I can do. I apologize to all my German viewers. That was a massacre, but there you go. Schadensumpf is a marsh-like moor that's very sparsely populated. There are sort of tiny little like outcrops of tiny villages, if you can even call them that, of these kind of semi-wild men, not really a hugely civilized area of Middenland. But there are villagers there that are eking out a living, digging out bog iron from the bog itself. So they make a fair trade, taking out the iron from that bog and trading it with the villagers locally to produce the steel needed to defend Middenheim and Middenland as a whole. It as well, because it's quite hard to get around in that bog area, has also become a bit of a hideout for any of the outlaws around Middenland who are looking to avoid civilization and the rule of law. The bog itself is actually kind of I suppose if it existed in our world, it would be a kind of bird sanctuary. There's a number of birds that like to migrate when they move through their northern migration, land at Schadensumpf, and they sort of migrate there. One in particular bird species that likes to do it is a species called the black crane, which often lives most of the year down in Tilia, but during the summer migrates north to the bogs up here in Middenland, and they're often killed, or they used to be killed and hunted because they would produce remarkable feathers for plumage that the nobles like to put in their hats. Upon sort of seeing this and seeing the crane dying out, Boris decreed a tax on the killing of any of these cranes. So it's just really kind of increased the amount of illegal hunting and poaching that goes on of the cranes, and increased the criminal element within this area. In terms of the province itself, Middenland exports a number of fine products. It's known in particular for exporting its iron. There is a thriving wine industry around Delbrez, presumably with vines growing on the Howling Hills. And they are also known for exporting wool and wool clothing and things like that, with sheep grazing and the like. Also, due to its proximity to the Middle Mountain region, which is up there near Middenheim, that sort of beginning of the mountain range there, they also mine a lot of silver out of there to export across the empire as well. Looking at some of the settlements of Middenland, one of its major settlements is the town of Carroburg to the south. So Carroburg is built on the steep banks of the River Reich. Now, because of the bank is built on such a steep incline, the town itself is really just made up of a bunch of twisting staircases, with the richest of the citizens of Carroburg living at the top of the hill towards the top end, and the poorest near the bottom. This is because often the human waste and water that runs through the streets of Carroburg tends to flow downhill. Thus, the higher up the hill, the cleaner the area you live, the more expensive the housing. At the very top of the hill, there sits two mansions. The first mansion is officially the mansion of the Elector Count of Carroburg, so technically belongs to Boris Todbringer. There's said not to be a ground floor entrance to Boris's mansion in Carroburg. He has to go up a flight of stairs and get in at the first floor. The windows are said to be very narrow, almost like arrow slits. And it's said that Boris likes this mansion particularly because it's very hard to storm should the local populace come down on him in some kind of riot or attack of any kind. So he tends to like the mansion he's been assigned at Carroburg for whenever he's visiting. Usually it's actually taken up by a chap called Wolfram. Wolfram is the current heir to Middenland, but I'm not exactly sure his relation to Boris. I think he might be a cousin or something like that. He's not Boris's son. That's a different story we'll get into later on in this video. But yeah, he's some kind of relation and the heir apparent to Boris's province. Now, you might ask why people would be looking to storm Boris's palace. Well, the Middenlanders are known to be a stubborn people and do tend to be quick to stand up for something they don't think's right. As such, it's kind of a traditionalist yet liberal society because the citizens of Middenland will be quicker to speak up than the citizens of most other provinces around the empire. Now, Boris has run into a bit of trouble in Carroburg because he recently imposed a penny on the pound tax, which is the idea that for every pound of cargo brought into Carroburg through trade on the River Reich, they have to pay a penny in tax. And this has upset a number of people. Boris claims he needs the money to repair the defenses in the north of the province, but a lot of the citizens tend to think that it's just to fill the coffers of the Arl Ulrich, who is the head of the church of Ulrich in Middenland, actually for the entire empire, for those who do worship Ulrich. The other mansion at the top of the hill, however, belongs to someone entirely different. It belongs to Leopold von Bildhofen. Now, Leopold is the Duke of Carroburg. He tends to run the town as it stands by itself, second to the Elector Count. Whenever the Elector Count's in town, if he wants to change anything about Carroburg, he can. He actually holds the title of the Prince of Carroburg. Regardless of that, most of the day-to-day management of Carroburg is handled by Leopold. He lives in the other mansion at the top of the hill. Leopold himself is said to be a fairly good leader. He's known to be a keen philanthropist, often given to the local charities. Middenlanders particularly take the charities of orphans and war widows to their hearts and like to defend them should they be ill-treated in any way by the government or by anybody else. So Leopold is quite liked in Carroburg and tends to run things on the day-to-day in that city. Now, one other aspect of Carroburg that has become very famous around the Warhammer world are the Carroburg Greatswords, said to be the finest swordsmen in the Empire as a military unit. These men have become almost mythical in their skills with the greatsword and the battles they fought in. The Carroburg greatswords earned their reputation initially during a period of the Empire known as the Age of the Free Emperors. Now, this was essentially several hundred years in the Empire's history where they were fighting amongst themselves and there was not ever one overall declared emperor. They were effectively in a state of civil war for a very long period of time. Now, Carroburg, being a border town, has often passed between the powers of Reichland and Middenland itself. At the time, I believe it was in the hands of Reichland, and the Count of Middenland had decided to attack the town. Now, the great swords of Carroburg stood staunchly and defended the town almost single-handedly. Their uniforms, which had started the day white, had been covered in so much of the blood of their enemies that they had been completely stained head to toe red. And ever since that day, the Carroburg greatswords have worn red in honor of that great victory. And they are truly the most elite great swordsmen within the Empire. However, a lot of people are expecting them to be added to Total War Warhammer as a Middenland unit. This would actually be against the law, because although Carroburg is now part of Middenland, the great swords are still sworn to Reichland. So they still serve the Emperor Karl Franz in his capacity as the Elector Count of Reichland. So it might be interesting to see. I don't know how they'd make you. Maybe they just make them a regiment of renown for Reichland alone, or maybe they just give up on that concept and just let Middenland have them as their own regiment and don't get into complexities of who they're actually sworn to. But indeed, they are a Reichland regiment by law and reputation. Carroburg itself has been the site of a couple of great victories. It was where the War of Gitripper was ended due to their good defense there and a battle that took place. It's often played a significant role throughout the history of the Empire. Another interesting aspect about Carroburg is it's also home the Knights Panther, or more accurately, they have their head charter house a couple of miles up the road from Carroburg. Now, the Knights Panther themselves are a secular order, meaning that they've sworn loyalty to an institution of government, that being the empire itself, rather than to a god or a religion. So that's what makes them a secular order. The Knights Panther came into being after the Great Crusades, when the dictator Jafar from the Kingdom of Araby had marched up and then been fought back to his own lands by the Empire. And during these raids and during the defeat of the Kingdom of Araby by the Empire itself, many knightly orders had traveled down there and taken a lot of plunder and loot and brought it back to the Empire. Among these were a group of panthers that had been captured from the pleasure palace of Al-Haik, something like that. Forgiveness for any mispronunciation. But Al-Haik, and they took the panthers up with them back into the Empire and paraded them through the streets. These panthers, the citizens of the Empire, were awestruck by these majestic creatures, and they would often draw a crowd. And the Knights Panther have even been said to bring them off the battlefield from time to time. Now, eventually, over the years, the Knights Panther sort of formed as a group and decided to adopt as their icon these panthers that they'd brought up from Araby with them, and so had the icon of the panther placed upon their helms. Now, eventually, they added to that after their leopards had all died out of old age. Apparently they couldn't breed them, I don't know why, so they just all died out of old age, at which point the Knights Panther started to use their furs to sort of make saddle trim, to make cloaks out of, to add to the overall pantheriness of their look, to add to the panthers on their helms already. Now, the Knights Panther had sworn themselves to do two things, really: to be at constant war with Araby, no matter what, and to rid the world of chaos and mutants. Those are sort of their two main objectives as an organization. So Games Workshop got into trouble at one point in their early editions, or maybe they didn't get into trouble, maybe they changed this so they could avoid any kind of trouble. But in a lot of early editions, the Knights Panther were described as being completely involved in the racial sanctity of the Empire. Now, because the Knights Panther were known to have declared an eternal war against Araby, that had huge racist undertones. But I think what Games Workshop were trying to convey was that they wanted to stick to the racial purity of the Empire by killing mutants and killing any kind of deformities within the species of man, rather than necessarily trying to kill all the brown people of the world. I don't think that was their aim, but that has since been changed and doesn't really appear in the later editions of the Empire Army books. So I think that I'll give the benefit of the doubt to Games Workshop that they weren't going for a knightly order of massive racists, but were going for a knightly order of, I suppose, who like to kill deformed people. I guess that's better. Who knows? It's a grim and dark world in Warhammer. Anyway, so despite with their ongoing war with Araby, they have gone down there a couple of times and caused some trouble, and the Empire itself has sent out 2 decrees formally rebuking them. But they were eventually withdrawn because the Emperor at the time, in both cases, realized that it's better to slightly annoy Araby, who are very far away logistically and unlikely to strike back at the Empire, than it is to sort of upset a group of heavily armed lunatics within your own borders who are actually kind of handy against any kind of chaos uprisings or any kind of trouble that pops up within the Empire itself. So they had both been withdrawn, and the Empire kind of let the Knights Panther get on with whatever they're doing themselves. And the Knights Panther themselves have realized it's kind of hard to stay at war with someone who's so logistically far away, and in modern times have slightly shifted their efforts more towards the anti-chaos, anti-mutant side of things, and some in the Knights Order have taken to replacing the Panther upon their heads with the head of the Beastmen, which have become their new prime target number 1. So they are scouring the Drakwold woods, killing Beastmen wherever they can find them, looking to eliminate them from the face of the earth. And that's shown in some of the newer armors that they make and their newer helms, where it's Beastmen placed upon them rather than the Panthers of old. But they do still like to keep the leopard furs, and they are an elite unit of the Knightly Order. Now, in Total War Warhammer, I think what we are going to get is a Middenland faction fairly soon. We've seen hints of that with the Runefang of Boris Todbringer having its own campaign attributes, and the Middenland army on multiplayer battles being selected down, having things like Sons of Sigmar unselectable, things like Reiksguard are unselectable for the Middenland army. And it's stuff like that that hints very much at an independent Middenland faction coming down the works soon. And these will essentially be the Reiksguard for Middenland, I think. The elite knights that represent Middenland and defend it. So that's how that's going to work, I think, with the Knights Panther in the future of Total War Warhammer. They are cool. They are known to have taken up Arabic steeds from the south, so they may be a bit faster or a bit stronger than other knightly orders. Who knows? I'm sure Creative Assembly will distinguish them somehow from the other knightly orders within the Total War Warhammer game itself. Moving on, Karaberg, as well as being the home of the Knights Panther, is home to something far more sinister as well. And that is a secret cult known as the Cult of the Yellow Fang. Now, these are worshippers of the Horned Rat, who is technically the god of the Skaven. Now, Midland's had a torrid history with the Skaven. The plague I mentioned earlier, known to us, and the Empire's never really figured this out, but the plague I mentioned earlier that helped wipe out the province of Drakwold was actually a plague released by the Skaven, in particular Clan Pestilence. Now, this plague, along with a war that the Skaven followed up the plague with, is a war that became to be known as the Skaven War, and it effectively wiped out 3/4 of the entire imperial population. This was around the year of the plague, so around the year 1110, 1111 is when the war first started. Now, almost the entirety of the empire was struck down by this. Skaven roamed the lands freely, they enslaved huge swathes of the human population that had even survived the plague. And this was it. This looked like the Vermintide had come. This looked like the end of days for man. This looked like Skaven had won. Middenland, on the other hand, were the one holdout. Middenheim had managed to cut off itself from the general populace, had remained largely untouched by the plague, and just waited it out while the plague died out around the rest of the empire. This proved to be a hugely wise decision from the Elector Count at the time, who was a guy called Mandred von Zelt. The Skaven had come, marched to the surface, and had besieged Middenheim for a while, but Middenheim had managed to fight them off, fight them through their own sewer system, fight the Skaven away from Middenheim. In retreat, it said that Skaven set up a settlement or a potential future settlement of sorts underneath Middenheim, so that might play into Total War Warhammer at a later date with the introduction of the Skaven. But anyway, for the point of this video, the Skaven retreat. Mandred essentially rallies the forces of the entire empire, managed to fight off Skaven. They were helped a bit by the fact that Skaven actually started to fall victims to the plague themselves. The disease had mutated and had started to affect the Skaven troopers and the Skaven clans themselves, so their numbers started to dwindle extremely rapidly. So between the years 1122 and 1124, Mandred takes the fight to the Skaven, slays hundreds of thousands of them, chases them back into the Under Empire, and eventually ends them at the Battle of Averheim and the Battle of the Howling Hills. So he wins the day. Apparently that's Skaven defeated, and that's that done. But no, the Skaven, not one to take a defeat lying down, had arranged for the assassination of Mandred, who at this point had been crowned emperor for uniting the provinces of Man and for fighting off what surely would have been the extinction of the empire itself. So they allowed him to rule for a little bit of time, but the Skaven sent an assassin soon after from Clan Eshin to kill this new emperor. What the assassin had done is killed him and then left evidence that it had been a mutant that had done it rather than any Skaven. And through their own sort of subversion and through just the passage of time, the idea of the Skaven eventually entered into myth. Except that Midlanders are huge traditionalists. So they still do things, maybe if they don't even believe it's real, they'll still do things out of tradition. So even now, underneath Middenheim, all their storm drains and sewer systems are locked up and segregated into segments to prevent any kind of future Ratman invasion, even though the majority of people within the Empire now believe that they were a made-up threat and just a mythical creatures. Maybe it was a sort of a small uprising of beastmen or something like that. That's kind of the general understanding within the Empire. So indeed, the Skaven have pulled off the trick that many say what's the saying with the devil? But devil's best trick was convincing the world he didn't exist, and that seems to be the Skaven strategy at the moment. However, because Midlanders are such huge traditionalists, it's not beyond the realm of understanding that some of them have remembered the Skaven intrusion, still believe the Skaven to be true, and worship the Horned Rat. Now, the Skaven has since made contact with this cult known as the Yellow Fang cult, who worship the Horned Rat out of Carroburg. And although their cult does spread throughout the Empire, it's really headquartered at Carroburg at the moment. Their aim is to worship the Horned Rat to facilitate the takeover of Skaven and bring about the end of all things the Empire. But they also believe that humans are still kind of superior to rats, so they're happy to let the Skaven win. But then their notion is that they as humans are just better than the Skaven. So as humans who worship the Horned Rat won't mind them as the remnants of the cult killing off and enslaving the rest of the Skaven. However silly and stupid a plan that seems, I suppose they're not called cult followers for no reason. So they're just kind of lunatics who worship the Horned Rat. And they're just an interesting element of what makes up Carroburg as a city. Moving on, we have Middenheim, the capital of Middenland, the pride of the province itself. Now, Middenheim is essentially a huge fortress. I suppose it's probably the closest that men have come to building a carrack-like structure. Middenheim had been constructed around the time of Sigmar, maybe just a little bit before the arrival of Sigmar, in fact. The Teutoburg kings had found this mountain with a flat top, and although not being great builders themselves, they somehow managed to convince or pressure the dwarves who were living around the area at the time, dwarves who were living in the middle mountain, the mountain range near Middenheim, to help them carve out and build a city out of this huge rock sitting by itself in the province of Middenland. So the dwarves helped them and they build this majestic fortress city built on top of a cliff. I suppose if you were to draw a real world allegory, I mean, just in my own personal experience, I suppose you'd be looking at just an epic version of kind of an Edinburgh castle where it's just surrounded on all sides with cliff faces, essentially, except for sort of a thin road in and out of it. In relation to Middenland, there are 4 viaducts that provide water and the roads in and out of the town itself. It's highly fortified and really sits majestic atop this mountain, dominating the landscape around it for miles and miles. It's said that the god Ulrich himself founded Middenheim because Ulrich, pictured here, without his usual hammer and war gear, this is him kind of relaxing and holding the 2 moons of the Warhammer world in his hand, had a brother, and his brother was the god Tal. Now, Tal is the empire and human god of nature, and here he is depicted holding the sun. So he's sort of nature and sort of beasts, probably herbivores more than beasts in general, whereas Ulrich is nighttime and cold and winter and war. That's Ulrich. And Tal is peace. And Tal had this mountain, and he said to his brother one day, I'm going to gift you, here you go, bro. Here's a mountain, have it. Here's a present from me to you. And in a typical, maybe kind of dickish brother style, Ulrich goes, thanks, man, and immediately punches the top off the mountain. It said that him punching the top off the mountain started a spark, which became the eternal flame of Ulrich, which we'll get into a little bit later in this video. But I don't know, it seems a bit of a weird story. Your brother gives you a mountain and you just punch it in half. But that's how they explain how they got their flat mountain to build their fortress city on. When this mountaintop was formed, apparently by Ulrich himself, it said that the king of the Teutons at the time had been given a vision by Ulrich to build a massive fortress here, which is when they employed the dwarves, as I mentioned earlier. The dwarves burrowed up through the mountain, and it took them 100 years to complete building Middenheim itself. Upon its completion, Vulcan, who is described as the son of Artur, the king who first sort of pronounced that Middenheim should be a town on this mountain, had a vision again from Ulrich that told him to build the Temple of Ulrich on the sacred site in Middenheim. And that, again, took another 50 years to complete. So a lot of huge, very complex structures taken very long times to complete in Middenheim. Now, Middenheim's very well defended, being firstly on the cliffs on all sides. It's also said to have been described as having these huge cannon. One cannon in particular had been built in Middenheim that could only be loaded by a giant. This was during an event called the Storms of Chaos that was kind of a prelude to the end times, but it eventually got retconned out of canon for Warhammer. So I'm not sure if Middenheim at this point actually have this enormous cannon or not, but they did at one point, and I thought it was just a cool picture, so I thought I'd include that with you. But very hard to take Middenheim, although it has been taken in the past. Probably most famously when Grom the Paunch took it and ripped out the roof of their most sacred building, the Temple of Ulrich, to build his wolf chariot, and then left the town. So, although hugely difficult, not impossible to take Middenheim. In terms of the running of the city itself, Middenheim is really subject to a lot of bureaucracy. It's run by a number of different public commissions, some of which have existed for so long that no one can actually remember the purpose of them, but they'll still keep on running nonetheless, because don't forget, the Middenlanders are keen traditionalists, even if they don't know why they're carrying out traditions. And of course, it's ruled over by Boris himself, Boris Todbringer, but he does have a series of councillors under him who help him with the running of it, and a number of commissions as well. So you have something like the Commerce, Trade and Taxation Commission, the Public Works Commission, the Health Commission, the Education Commission, the Welfare Commission, and even the Elf, Dwarf and Halfling Interest Commissions, because there's a number of different sort of species living in Middenheim as well, with elves living there, dwarfs of course, and quite a lot of halflings actually, said even regardless of its distance from the Moot, which is the home of the halfling people. The city itself is laid out on the cliff, as you can see here. A lot of its sort of artistic depictions have it in multiple layers, which may very well be true. I think that's probably open to interpretation. In terms of the map itself, this is what it would look like. They would really have to address what this would look like for the siege battles in Total War Warhammer, because they really do just need to, if they're going to give you the siege battles in the formats as they exist today, really what you'd have is, if someone was trying to take Middenheim, they'd have to come up one of these narrow bridges, and that would be about their only option, which would just be a complete massacre. But there you go. That's how Middenheim's described as laid out, at least in the fancy role-playing game version that Games Workshop put out. But it gives us an idea of how they think it's laid out. A couple of sites to point out here on the map is, of course, firstly, the Temple of Ulrich, dominating the very center of the town, head place of the Church of Ulrich, and the place where they keep the sacred flame of Ulrich, which I'll get into a bit later on in the video. Due to it being built on this mountaintop, there's actually quite a lot of limited space in Middenheim. And when someone's looking to get buried, and as you can imagine, over the centuries, there's been a lot of people dying in this town, and space is limited, so you can't really get buried within the city walls unless you're particularly rich. The rich and noble families go here to the Gardens of Moor, where they afford a burial plot or a family burial plot. But everywhere else, and more common than almost anywhere else in the Empire, the peasantry and whoever else can't afford to have a plot in the Gardens of Moor tend to cremate their dead. So that makes it sort of a unique cultural feature of the city of Middenheim, just due to their lack of space. Now, in terms of another interesting feature of the city of Middenheim, is actually battalioned in Middenheim is a unit of Griffin Legion Kislevites. Now, this is because there's a long-standing sort of friendship agreement between Middenland and Kislev, and they trade a regiment of knights. So at Middenheim, there is a unit of Griffin Legion, and in return, there's a regiment of Knights Panther stationed in Kislev. Now, I think it would be really cool to see the Kislevite Griffin Legion as a regiment of renown that they can only recruit one of in the campaign for Middenland. And it would be a great little preview of the Kislev faction as a whole. That would be lovely to see, but I think that's really wishful thinking at this stage with Total War Warhammer, as I don't think we'll see hide nor hair of a Kislev faction until at least the second part of the game, maybe even the third. So we'll wait and see what they do with Kislev, but I doubt we'll see it anytime soon. But it'd be a nice little touch, I think, just to stick to the lore and to reinforce the amicable relationship between Kislev and Middenland. Moving on, let's have a talk about the people of Middenland itself. I've made a few points about some of their behaviors, with them being sort of having a strong sense of tradition, being quite outspoken about taxes and things that affect them. They're not really afraid to riot and to speak their minds and to hear themselves heard, particularly about issues that sort of hit them at their core, things like war widow pensions, things like orphans. If you do wrong by these vulnerable people within their society, they will not hesitate to rise up and have a go at you. They are sort of staunch traditionalists and will defend honor and hold people responsible for crimes. And a lot of this is based around the religion of Ulrich itself. In a way, a lot of the citizens of Middenheim are like the god Ulrich in microcosm. They're stern traditionalists with a strong sense of honor. They like to keep their word, but they are firebrands with a really aggressive temper if you irk them the wrong way. That's sort of as a stereotype, very traditionally held view of the Middenlanders themselves. It's said that as you go further south in Middenland, it softens a bit, but to anyone of the Empire outside of Middenland, the people from the south of Middenland and people from the north are equally as stern and traditionalists and sort of hard-headed. So to anyone outside of Middenland, a Middenlander are always going to be a Middenlander. Kind of as close as you can come for a human being a dwarf almost. They're that sort of hard-headed and just stuck in their ways. Midlanders also don't hesitate by speaking up. They won't just riot, but they will actually challenge the validity of any leader who doesn't seem up to the task. So there is this element of you have to prove yourself. You have to prove yourself as a leader, no matter where you are. So from a regiment up until the elector count himself, if you prove yourself unworthy or dishonorable, they will run you out of office. They will have a coup and change leadership within the regulations and within the laws of the land itself as well, but they will do it. In terms of what they value, really Midlanders are defenders of pride, firstly their own, and property, because it's very much an idea of an individualistic society in Midland. You have your land, you protect it yourself. It's the sort of is one man not entitled to the sweat of his brow kind of argument. So you're responsible for defending it. You should be able to look after your own family. There's very much that sense within Middenland. This sort of combination of personality traits that Middenlanders tend to have does make their politics fairly rabble-rousing, and they sort of really speak to a kind of populist element to the people of Middenland. So it's very much different from the political landscape, which may be a bit sly or a bit more backhanded within other parts of the Empire. Whereas in Middenland, if someone challenges you, they'll just get up and say it, and they'll raise any points. They'll just jeer up a crowd and try and turn anybody against you. That's kind of how politics works in Middenland, which is very different from the rest of the Empire. Middenlanders also pride themselves on their hardiness and their traditional values. They often mock any of their foppish southern cousins. Foppish or dandyish, I think they like to mock them thoroughly. A thing that's slightly contrary to that is they all wear the foppish hats with feathers in them, so who's to say what they consider foppish? But any kind of poetry or stuff like that, they're not huge fans of. They're hard people who live in a hard part of the world, and just enjoy doing that and will mock anyone who's a bit of a softie. In fact, it's said if you were to enter into a Middenland tavern and order yourself a Bretonian brandy, you're effectively signing your death warrant there and there, because no one's going to like you in that bar, and you're either going to be mugged or just straight out killed. There are sort of regional rivalries amongst the Middenlanders themselves. Much like any nation, there's sort of local rivalries, not that really ever escalate to the size of full-blown wars, but these rivalries have often gone along the lines of the ancient clans within the Teutogan people. But for the most part, they limit themselves to small skirmishes, even sort of enlarged bar fights, shall we say, and don't really affect the stability of the overall empire. It's just something that they've always had to deal with within Middenland. And that about sums it up for the people of Middenland. As I said, stern, traditionalist, hardy, prideful people, but they do make some of the fiercest warriors, and the fact that they stress martial skill so much, and being able to defend yourself and defend what's yours and defend your province is so stressed from birth. They really do make some of the finest soldiers within the empire. Moving on, let's have a look at the religion of Ulrich itself. Now, Ulrich is pictured here holding up the two moons of the Warhammer world, as I showed earlier, with the blades around him, symbolizing him being the god of war, the god of winter, and he's also the god of wolves. The cult of Ulrich is led by Emil Valgir, and this is Emil here. He's a hardy soul. And Emil has the position called Ar Ulrich. Now, the Ar Ulrich is essentially the Grand Theogonist of the Church of Ulrich. He is the guy in charge. He is the equivalent of Volkmar the Grim for the religion of Ulrich. Ar Ulrich himself, and apart from being the head of the Church of Ulrich, is also, in fact, given the privilege of having an elector vote as well. So, for those of you who don't know, an elector vote is how the empire decides who its emperor is. There are a few people that have them. All of the elector counts have them, so the counts of all the different provinces of the empire. The Grand Theogonist has one, I believe, and Ar Ulrich is the other person who has a vote in the electoral process. So just to give you an idea of how seriously his role is taken within the empire. Ulrich is a much older god than Sigmar. In fact, Sigmar himself worshipped Ulrich, and that's why he kind of took up the hammer of Galmaraz as his chosen, or that's why he took up the hammer as his chosen weapon in honor of Ulrich, who was said to wield a double-handed hammer as his weapon of choice, much like the White Wolves do as well in honor of him. And worship of Ulrich goes back as far as 3,000 years, so up to 500 years before the emergence of Sigmar himself. The religion of Ulrich, once the empire was founded, eventually started to recede and is now really primarily concentrated in the north. Now, the main headquarters of the Church of Ulrich has moved around over the years. It's usually been in Middenheim, but there was a point during the Age of Civil War, which I mentioned earlier in this video, the age known as the Age of the Three Emperors, where the cult of Ulrich moved its headquarters from Middenheim to Talabakland. And that's where they made their headquarters for a couple of centuries, I think even, before eventually moving back to Middenheim. So Talabakland is also a very big religious supporter of the cult of Ulrich itself. And that may play into Total War Warhammer later on, maybe them being sort of closely allies, having a sort of diplomatic bonus between each other because they do share the worship of the god Ulrich. Now, the Church of Ulrich is run by Emil Valgir, as I said, but it's also run by a council. Now, this council is made up of the heads of the major temples of Ulrich around the empire itself. And just to highlight a couple of characters on this council for you, people like Wolfmar von Krutz, who is the head of the church in Talabheim, the second most important headquarters of the Church of Ulrich, and he continuously and without equivocation denounces Sigmar as not a god, Sigmar just being a man. I think Sigmar himself might probably agree with Wolfmar, but that is up to the cult of Sigmar. So he is very outspoken against the cult of Sigmar itself, professing, as I said, almost heretically, that Sigmar is not in fact a god. Another interesting character is Catherine von Siert from the Sudfast temple in Nordland, and she runs a temple, and she's a high priestess of a temple that is solely made up of women. So there are women priests of Volkmar, and they do have their own temple, in fact, in Nordland. So just a couple of the interesting characters on the Council of the Church of Ulrich, just to highlight them for you. There are a number of priests of Ulrich, much like there are a number of priests of Sigmar. And they look fairly similar because obviously Ulrich, being the hammer-wielding god that he is, was worshipped by Sigmar, and thus Sigmar himself has taken on many of the traits of the god Ulrich himself as a worship deity as he stands in the Empire today. So the priests aren't that dissimilar. They often have a white wolf cloak. Now within Middenland and Ulrich religion, if you deign to wear a white wolf cloak, you can only do so under a particular circumstance, which is either you killed him by hand yourself, the wolf, or you killed him with a weapon you forged yourself. Those are the only two ways you earn the right to wear the cloak of the White Wolf within the Kingdom of Middenland. And these warrior priests often do that as sort of younger men. They go out and they earn their right to wear the white cloak. As I said, the priests of Ulrich are really quite similar to the priests of Sigmar in their appearance. They do have the sort of shaved head, but they do have these luscious beards as opposed to the clean-shaven priests of Sigmar. And they are very good at martial skills, but they also have different abilities. So whereas the priests of Sigmar's, where you're maybe familiar with the prayer system that Total War Warhammer uses, now allow me to come up with some theories here. There have been some abilities associated with the priests of Ulrich in the past. Now this has really been limited to the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game, more than necessarily rules written in stone on the tabletop for Priests of Ulrich, but I thought I'd give you guys a rundown of those just to give you an inkling of some of the options Creative Assembly have in terms of the abilities they can give the Priests of Ulrich in Total War Warhammer that would distinguish them from the Priests of Sigmar. These first two I'm going to mention are just mentioned in lore. They've never actually been in rules in any game, whether it be the role-playing game or the tabletop war game from Games Workshop. But those are called the Blessing of the Bloodhand, which essentially it starts a Berserker Rage in an assigned unit or another person. Or there's the Blessing of Ulrich, which is essentially kind of a similar thing. It's said to unleash a kind of savagery from within a person, so maybe makes them a better fighter, maybe a plus bonus to melee attack. That might be a possible option. Now, in terms of some of the abilities they've been given in the role-playing fantasy game, Priests of Ulrich have been given the Battle Fury, which is essentially a kind of bloodlust. So again, maybe just an increase in melee or an increase in armor piercing or something like that. There's an ability called Crush the Weak, which is described as priests giving somebody the ability to want to scorn and crush the weak or cowardly. Now, this might be an interesting one, maybe a speed up so that units can catch fleeing units. That might be quite cool, like a plus 6% or plus 10% movement speed, just so you can charge after units and hunt them down. There's a simple ability also called Frostbite. You can guess that, but that essentially freezes the enemy. So it'd be great if the Priest of Ulrich had some, instead of sort of Net of Amantok, had some kind of freezing spell. And that also opens up the possibilities of ice magic, which is obviously a big part of Kislevite lore and how they do magic in Kislev. Heart of the Wolf, which is an Inspire spell, so maybe morale bonuses there for the Heart of the Wolf ability. The Hoarfrost 4, which essentially grants someone immunity to cold, but because no one else is ever going to cast cold on you, I'm not sure if we'd ever see that one in Total War Warhammer, at least not yet. Maybe if Kislev ever made an appearance, that might get retconned in. But nothing immediately obvious about that one. Howl of the Wolf gives allies a lust for battle. Again, some kind of buff is a possibility. Ice Storm, which again is a damage dealing ice spell that essentially conjures up a storm of ice, which could be a great one. And the Ice King's Decree, which again is unleashes what is called freezing fire. So maybe a fire, kind of use the same graphic as a fireball, but make it blue and call that one the Ice King's Decree. And there's another one just called Wild Fury, I think it is. And that one just enables frenzy. So you see them falling into similar categories. Essentially what you'd need, this is what I see the Priest of Ulrich having as abilities. You can pick any of these names you want for it, but an ice damage spell, an ice freeze spell, frenzy spell that gives someone frenzy, and a morale buff ability or prayer. Those are the big four, and essentially all of the ones I just read to you fall into those four categories. So those would be the big four that I think the priests of Ulrich should have when Middenland becomes its own faction. As I said previously, Ulrich himself is described as having a two-handed warhammer. He has a thick black beard, flick, flowing, sort of bound hair, as they called it. Almost seems to bring forward some L'Oreal because I'm worth it kind of imagery in my head for some reason, but there you go. He's got very nice hair that's gone into in some detail for some reason. And he has because he is the god of winter, he has permanent sort of frost frozen onto his beard that gives it a silvery shimmer from certain angles to represent his bringing of the winter, as it were. Now, one of the most sacred sites of the Church of Ulrich, and I've brought it up a couple of times, it's come up in the videos, is the Flame of Ulrich that burns in the Temple of Ulrich in Middenheim. Now, the Temple of Ulrich is the churches and the temples of Ulrich, all the constructions to Ulrich are usually fortifications more than churches. If you were to walk past one, you'd think that's a fortress rather than a place of worship. And they're built that way because of the stress of Ulrich being a god of war. All of his priests are highly trained in martial skills and the use of weapons and being able to smite fiends of chaos themselves and sort of plow down any of their enemies. So all the priests of Ulrich are highly skilled warriors, maybe even more so than the priests of Sigmar, because the worship of Ulrich stresses combat that much more. Now, Ulrich himself never really wore a helmet, and the most devoted followers of Ulrich try to uphold this tradition. Not everyone, it seems like in modern Warhammer lore, this has slightly fallen away from the way that they describe units in Middenland. But a number of the most zealous followers of Ulrich won't wear a helmet because they feel that it shows cowardice to wear a helmet. You're afraid of getting hurt. Whereas if you don't wear a helmet, you're all good. One could make the same argument for armor, but apparently that doesn't apply. Ulrich is said also to be a deity that doesn't like the use of missile weapons and black powder. Although again, this has been slightly softened with the army of Middenland definitely having access to cannon, black powder weapons, and missile units as well. Particularly the huntsmen of the Empire, some of the best of them come out of the Drakwold in Middenland. And so the use of bow is maybe accepted in that circumstance. So it's a bit more of a antiquated concept, I think, the idea that Ulrich detests everyone that uses missiles, because a lot of them do, and maybe it's only the most zealous followers of Ulrich that tend to stay away from missiles because of their dedication and faith in the god Ulrich himself. So you won't see a warrior priest using a crossbow, but then again, he won't kill a huntsman he meets in the wood who's using a bow either, or necessarily even give him any shit about it. He'll just be like, okay, that's cool, bro. You're killing monsters, I'm killing monsters. Let's have a wander through these dark and dangerous woods. So that's the kind of relationship, I think, as it stands at the moment with Ulrich and missile weapons. The worshippers of Ulrich also have a very sort of Viking-like belief that there's no better way of dying. And if you do die in battle, you will be welcomed into Ulrich's feast halls forever to dine and drink ale and sing of your glorious days of battle. That kind of thing. Very similar to old Viking beliefs. There's very much a link between the cult of Ulrich and the sort of old Viking ways as well. The Flame of Ulrich, on the site of the Temple of Ulrich in Middenheim, is one of the most sacred places to any worshipper of Ulrich in the old world. As I said earlier in the video, it's said to have started when Ulrich punched the top off the mountain upon which Middenheim was later built. And that started the spark that started this eternal flame. And it's said that this eternal flame is kind of a shower of the will of Ulrich. And if you are uncorrupted and Ulrich finds you pure, the flame will never harm you. Now, there are a certain number of characters who have actually gone through this test and won the loyalty of the people of Middenland, or even before the people of Middenland, the Teutogan tribes. So Sigmar himself, when he asked for the aid of the Teutogans, they refused initially, to the point where the only way of him getting them to cooperate, and he needed them as they were known as the fiercest warriors of the tribes at the time, so the only way he could get them to join his confederacy was to defeat their chieftain in single combat. He accepted this challenge, and during that fight, which was actually held in the Temple of Ulrich, it said that Artur, which was the name of the chief at the time, managed to hit Ulrich and managed to hit Sigmar into the flames of Ulrich. And not only did Sigmar emerge untouched, bear in mind Sigmar was also a worshipper of Ulrich. So not only did Sigmar emerge untouched, but he was sort of given renewed vigor. And it said as he screamed and hurtled himself towards Arthur for the final strike to smote him, his scream actually came out much more like a wolf's howl. And the people of the Teutogens took this both as a sign through his martial prowess through defeating their chieftain, but also that he had the blessing of Ulrich himself by being given renewed strength when he fell into the fire, and he wasn't burned or singed at all. So that's one of the examples of them seeing the flames of Ulrich as the purifying way, as them showing someone's pure intent. Another example is during the Great Invasion of Chaos, whereupon they'd managed to march down and take Prague, and the Empire, reunited under Magnus the Pious, was trying to put together a force to go and fight them in the north. He had a bit of trouble again convincing the Midlanders to follow him because they maybe saw him as unworthy. Up until that point, he wasn't the emperor. He was just some noble that had come out of Nullen, and very little was known about him. But he, as a test of his conviction and purity, walked through the flames of Ulrich and indeed emerged on the other side completely unharmed. And then the people of Middenland decided to join his cause, and they went on to defeat the armies of chaos. So it's a proven entity. Like, over history, it's been either told or told, but this fire does still burn within the temple, and it's a very sacred thing to the worshippers of Ulrich, really as a kind of way of determining the will of their god firsthand. So, very sacred site, very important to the worshippers of Ulrich. Now, at this point, you might be asking, if Sigmar was a worshipper of Ulrich, how did he come about to be worshipped himself as a god? Now, this wasn't really up to Sigmar himself. Sigmar, during his life, did not insist on being worshipped as a god. It wasn't until about 50 years after his death that a chap called Johann Hellstrom came along and started to preach that Sigmar was a god in his own right. Now, the differences he drew a lot of similarities with Ulrich because Sigmar himself was inspired by Ulrich. But the difference was that the Church of Ulrich is very much focused on individualism. It's focused on you being able to protect your home and your relationship with Ulrich as a person. There's no real loyalty. Your only loyalty in the Church of Ulrich is to Ulrich himself. There's no written loyalty into your provincial lord. There's no written loyalty into anything else. All that Ulrich asks is that you be a person of your word. So if you pledge allegiance to someone, you keep that allegiance. But there's nothing that binds you to any larger body like the Empire. So Johann Hellstrom came along, and he started to preach the words of the Church of Sigmar. And at the center of the Church of Sigmar was the idea that you owe loyalty to the Empire. And as a kind of ambassador for the Empire, a personification of the Empire itself, Sigmar as a god. Essentially, what the Church of Sigmar did was it started to refocus people around worshipping and owing allegiance to the Empire through their religion, not just to themselves and not just to Ulrich. So it began a process of rejiggering how people thought about themselves within their social society. That was kind of the idea behind the religion. And because it had these elements where the Church of Sigmar does encourage you to have obedience not only to Sigmar himself, but to the Empire and to the representatives of the Empire, thusly the nobility. The nobility liked this idea and very quickly started to convert to the worship of Sigmar themselves, because the religion of Sigmar was telling their people, as a representative of the highest representative of the Empire in this current area, you owe me your allegiance as much as you owe it to the Sigmar, the god, because I, as an embodiment of the Empire, almost represent Sigmar myself. So they were quick to jump on that bandwagons, and where the nobles went, they kind of decided how the coffers were spent, so what churches went up and where, and so the Church of Sigmar rapidly spread. Due to the stubborn nature of the Teutogens and now the Middenlanders, they weren't going to switch to a new church, so that was never going to happen. So thusly, Middenland has really become a hotbed for Ulrich worship, whereas the rest of the Empire started to switch towards Sigmar, really to facilitate the nobles' control of the citizenry, and to make them a little bit more manageable. They found the Church of Sigmar was a bit more lenient, and whether that's maybe a cynical view, and Sigmar did save the entire Empire, yes, but he himself never decided to be worshipped as a god. That was done after his death, and for seemingly not completely altruistic reasons. So that's how the Church of Sigmar started to spread and start to replace the Church of Ulrich to a certain degree. A couple of the quirks of the Church of Ulrich that I thought you guys might find interesting is a couple of their signs. So the Church of Ulrich is done by, the sign of Ulrich is done by holding your middle and ring finger down to your palm. So for those of you who can't visualize that, it's essentially devil horns. Devil horns is the Church of Ulrich. So you do devil horns with your fingers pointing out, that's for Ulrich. But if you flip it around, it means a ruler version of sod off, much like the V for victory sign in our own society, or at least in the UK. And often another quirk of the Church of Ulrich is how you make a pact. Whereas we have like maybe the spit in your hand handshake, they do a bite each other's hand and then mix all that saliva and spit together in a handshake because you bite the other person on their hand until they bleed. It's a bit less dignified, but there you go. That's how you seal a pact as a follower of the Church of Ulrich. In terms of sort of their written down scriptures, as it were, you have be aggressive and confrontational when you need to be. There's an idea of not doing any kind of deceit. So this makes the people, the armies that worship Ulrich, think that sort of tactical slyness is a form of deceit. So they tend to have very straightforward armies or straightforward thinking generals, particularly if they're devout followers of Ulrich, that just tend to charge in because any kind of retreat strategy or slyness or hiding in woods is considered a form of deceit and goes against the teachings of Ulrich, which kind of limits their tactical options in war, but there you go. I'm not going to be able to change a Middenlander's mind on that, so there you go. Again, the value of keeping your word makes it in there for them. Obey superiors. I think that's maybe militarily, not necessarily a blanket obedience, because as we've covered, Middenlanders like to kick out and make a fuss when need be. Or it just might be obey your superiors militarily who are able to best you. It might have that kind of interpretation. Defend your honor. Yep, that's standard. Only wear the wolf if you've killed it with your own hands or with a weapon of your own making. I mentioned that one earlier. And this is the one I mentioned where there's a slight resistance to missile weapons. It's no black powder, crossbows, or missile weapons, or helmets. Now that's I think that's maybe been retconned out a little bit, because in Middenland there are definitely units of the army of Middenland that wear helmets, that use black powder, and that use missiles as well. So that's maybe an element of Ulrich worship that has fallen out of favor. Now, there are certain sects within the Church of Ulrich as well. There's the Order of the Howling Wolf, who tend to stress self-reliance and not living sort of as a dependent on the state, being able to farm your own food, protect your own family, build your own weapons, that kind of thing. There's also the Order of the Winter Throne, which is kind of like an apocalyptic order. They're not trying to bring about the apocalypse themselves, but the apocalypse under the worshippers of Ulrich is called Evernacht. I hope that I pronounced it. I probably slaughtered that, but that's how I think it's said. And I think that essentially translates into any kind of English as Evernight, maybe. That's a guess. And that's essentially the end days where like all the constructs of man will be wiped away and man himself will be wiped from the earth. And they think that time is imminent. And I suppose technically, because end times came about, they were actually right. But they're an apocalyptic cult within the Church of Ulrich. And the head of this apocalyptic cult is a chap called Ulrikon Hargard. And he's just a huge guy of Norscan descent, massive guy, doesn't speak apparently. And all he consumes, such as his faith, all he consumes is melted snow. As a worshipper of the god of winter, that's all he feels he should put into his body. And he essentially sounds like a bit of a zealot, but an interesting character. Now, of course, as well as those sects, there's also the White Wolves. Now, the White Wolves are a Templar knightly order, meaning that they are devoted to the Church of Ulrich, and as a result, they're subservient to our Ulrich, the leader of the church. And I think they're subservient to the leader of the church, in fact, before they're subservient to the elector count of the province. So whereas the Knights Panther might obey the orders of Boris, the Knights of the White Wolf would definitely sooner obey the orders of Al Ulrich than necessarily Boris Todbringer. Now, these guys actually have a seat on the council of the Church of Ulrich, along with the other high priests, so they help in the governing of the church. And the church itself, because Ulrich preaches self-reliance, the church is really in charge of securing and having a military to protect its pilgrims and its sites. And this is how the Order of the White Wolf was formed. They are in fact the largest Templar order, so the largest order dedicated to a god within the old world. So within the Empire itself, these guys are the largest sort of religious zealot, largest body of religious zealots to any one particular god that exists within the Empire. And as I slightly covered in my Missing Units video, these guys are just machines. They're melee machines. They have two-handed hammers that they use to just crush skulls. They're really a melee infantry. They're not really a charging infantry. They don't have a lance. They don't have a shield either, so they might be slightly more susceptible to missiles. But they will just stick it out and manage to go toe-to-toe with pretty much anything anyone can throw at them in terms of melee combat. Their order, along with the Church of Ulrich, is based in Middenland. And usually when they're not riding en masse to war, they're usually around, and any site or church or place of worship of Ulrich usually has one or two of these guys hanging around just to keep it secure, just to make sure its pilgrims are safe in the local area, and to make sure no one sort of messes with the shrines of Ulrich around the Empire. And as I said, these guys are really religious zealots, so they stick to the very stringent thing of no missile weapons, no gunpowder, no helmet. So they don't wear a helmet either, because Ulrich didn't wear a helmet, and helmets are a sign of cowardice in the faith of Ulrich, so why would they ever wear a helmet? So that's really what the Knights of the White Wolf are about. If they do a Middenheim faction, they have to include these guys. There's no way these guys won't be included if they release Middenheim as a faction in its own right. That would just be a crime against Warhammer, against Total War. They'd be doing themselves a huge disservice. I fully expect to see these guys in Total War Warhammer with the Middenland upgrade. Another unit that might actually be more of a regiment of renown necessarily than a tier of soldier. I reckon you'd be able to recruit Knights of the White Wolf much like you'd be able to recruit Knights Panther, if you see what I mean. They just have a common enough unit, much like you're able to recruit Reichsguard. It's the most elite kind of knight you can probably get, but a common enough unit that it's not a regiment of renown. But these guys might be a regiment of renown. These guys are the Swords of Ulrich. Now, essentially, this is just a very good swordsman unit made out of religious zealots. They have a very harsh training regime. Essentially, to be recruited into their ranks, what happens is you're not sat down and drilled and trained or anything. You have to pay to bring your own weapons, and essentially they just send you out on patrol. And the people they recruit into their ranks, they send you out on patrol in the Dracworld. So you're going to fight beastmen, probably trolls, maybe some forest goblins. God knows what you're going to bump into out there. And the only people they ever recruit into their ranks are the people who came back alive, and not only that, but fought with honor. So if you came back alive and hid in a tree, you're not getting in. They'll probably kill you upon your return if they've heard about it. But the only people they recruit into this particular company of swordsmen is, in fact, the guys who survived, and then they go on to train them to be elite swordsmen. I think these guys will essentially be the equivalent of the Sons of Sigmar for the Empire faction, if Middenland becomes its own faction. So these guys will be a regiment of renown, but an aspect of them is they're also a Templar infantry chapter. So these guys are funded and run by the Church of Ulrich. They're not run by the government. So they're not state troops. These guys are strictly under the control of the church itself, and they take orders from the church, not from Boris, not from the Elector Count, not from the Empire. So they're solely funded and run by the church. Now, moving on, let's have a look at some of the characters around and have a bit of a discussion about who the legendary lords for Middenland might be if they're ever introduced to Total War Warhammer. Now, of course, in the game, we already have Boris Todbringer. Technically, his full title is Graf Boris Todbringer. Now, I think that's a title rather than his name, but he's often referred to as Graf Todbringer or Graf Boris, but Graf's often tied into his name, and I think that's a title as opposed to his first name being Graf, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So, Boris Todbringer, the Elector Count, the Grand Duke of Middenland, the Prince of Carraburg, the Protector of the Dracwold, and the Warden of the Middle Mountain, is the Elector Count for Middenland. He's its leader, said to be a brilliant warrior and a great statesman. So Boris Todbringer was married at a very young age, and his first wife was Maria von Richthofen. I think that's how you say it, Richthofen. And she died giving birth to their first son almost a year to the day after they were married. And their son was called Stephen, or Stefan. And Stefan was named heir to the province of Middenland within the sort of second day of his birth. Now, unbeknownst to Stefan, of course, as he's an infant at the time, Boris had also fathered a bastard child at approximately the same time. He'd gotten a lady of the court pregnant, and she'd given birth to a boy named Heinrich. Now, Heinrich and Stefan were almost exactly the same age. In fact, it's said that Heinrich would have been conceived the night before Boris married his wife, Maria. Not very faithful old Boris, but there you go, counts will be counts. And after a while, as these two boys grew up, it became immediately clear that Boris may have made an error. Stefan grew into a drooling, palsied invalid who was prone to fits of extreme violence and mania, and it was very plain that he had something very wrong with him and would not really be able to take over the crown. But Boris, looking to help his son, brought in a doctor who took over this kind of Svengali-like character within the town of Middenland. He was called the most fake Italian name you can ever imagine, Luigi Pavarotti. And of course, as you might guess, he was from Tilia, the Warhammer version of Italy. Now, Luigi somehow managed to make Stefan a little bit better, but even without his manic fits and just being a bit of a loon and being sort of sickly and not very well, he still wasn't really going to make a great Elector Count. But Heinrich, the bastard child, who'd been elevated to the point of Baron because he was, after all, the son of Boris Todbringer, but he was never, still bastardy is looked down upon within the Warhammer world. It's not unknown that a lord would maybe, say, adopt his bastard son and give him title after that. But this, in all honesty, with Todbringer being a Middenlander, he'd given his word that Stefan was his heir. He was never going to change that, no matter how logical or sensible it may be, because Heinrich was making a fine leader in his own right. He was said to be extremely intelligent, shown great skill and promise at martial pursuits, could command, looked like he could grow up to be a fantastic general. And so Boris had this problem of trying to dice with his two sons, as well as grieving for the loss of his wife. Although not necessarily faithful, he still loved her when he lost her. So this goes on for a while, with the kingdom very worried about who's eventually going to take over. And under some quite mysterious circumstances, his two sons are actually die within quick succession of one another, leaving no one to take over from Boris. At some point, he gets another lady of the court pregnant. At this point, a lot of time has passed. The sons had become virtually fully grown around the time of their passing, and Boris is getting on in years. So around the time of 47, he'd already got another lady of the court pregnant and fathered a bastard daughter this time, called Katrina, and eventually he set about looking to get remarried to try and have a male heir to take over the seat of Elector Count. And his second wife was Elise Niche of Nordland, Annika Elise Niche of Nordland, and she and Boris fell deeply in love with each other. They were married for 10 years, but alas, due to God knows why, maybe the gods just weren't smiling, Ulrich did not favor the marriage, whatever it was, Boris was never able to conceive a child with Elise. And in fact, she herself died 10 years after they were married. So now Boris is heirless. I think his heir at the moment is something like a cousin thrice removed or something like that. It's this chap called Wolfgram, but he's said to be sickly and he tends to spend most of his time in Karaberg, locked away. No one really sees him. No one's really sure what's wrong with him. So that's who his heir is. So he would like to ideally have a son, but Boris is getting on a bit now. He's at least 57 years old, and he doesn't have an heir, and there's no marriage in the line for him. After a while, having suffered all these losses in the family, he lost 2 wives, lost both his sons, it looks like he won't be able to pass on the name Todbringer. He starts to become melancholic and slightly despondent. He starts to take less and less interest in the running of the kingdom, and this melancholy is said to reach a point of feeble-mindedness where he doesn't seem to really care about the running of the kingdom. He just does whatever his advisors say. There's no sort of individual. He doesn't see a fight, at least for the political bureaucracy of running a province. He doesn't see any fights worth having. He'll still go out and lead his men in battle. It seems to be one of the few things he still gets satisfaction out of, just taking out his rage and sadness on the beastmen of the Drakwold and mowing them down. but alas, like, just through to all his loss, his ability as a leader is said to not be what it once was. Now, throughout this period of him slightly losing interest, tension started to rise up with Karl Franz, the emperor. Now, while Karl Franz's father died, Boris actually put himself up to be emperor amongst the Elector counts. And he did have the support of the Ulrich, which is the head of the Church of Ulrich, who always tends to vote for the Elector count of Middenland no matter what. I don't think in its history, except for maybe the time during the crisis of the Three Emperors, where there was a civil war for many, many years within the empire, Ulrich hasn't voted for the Count of Middenland to be the emperor. So he had that support. One assumes he maybe had support from some of the northern provinces as well, most likely Nordland. I think he came second, he came runner-up in the vote, but Karl Franz took it away and went on to become emperor. Since then, there's been some tensions. Karl Franz at one point decreed that mutants weren't a real thing and that these are just poor, sick human beings, whereas the policy in Middenland has always been kill them, they're offspring of chaos. And often, more often than not, they probably are, but there are some mutants who maybe just have like a clubbed foot, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're a spawn of chaos, it just means they have a clubbed foot. But in Middenland, they're sometimes likely just to be dragged out to the woods and left there to be adopted by some beastman clan and maybe turn traitor. So Boris, who actively looks, whose kingdom and province actually looks to hunt mutants, Karl Franz is telling them, there's no such thing as mutants, you need to stop it, you're killing human beings, stop that immediately. And the Middenlanders and Boris aren't happy about that decision at all, so that's caused some friction. And Karl Franz is very well aware of this, and he knows that Boris has always been difficult, although he does support the empire when it comes down to it, and he will be there. In terms of their own personal relationship, it's quite fraught, with Karl even being caught commenting that he feels that with sort of Boris's new change of mentality, that, quote, the old fool has finally cracked, just because of all the pain that Boris has gone through and all the trials and tribulations he's gone through, both personally and on the battlefield. Speaking of the battlefield, one of the defining characteristics of Boris Todbringer and his trials and tribulations of life, not just to mention the losses he suffered personally amongst his family, have been on the battlefield against Kazarak One-Eye. Now, Kazarak is probably the most prestigious leader of the beastmen that there has been for a number of years. He is a beastman of rare cunning and intelligence and started to raid all around the Drakwold. At one point, Boris caught up with him and challenged him to a duel. Boris managed to strike him across the eye with his runefang. Now, runefangs are given to the Elector counts of every province, and they're magical weapons forged long ago during the time of Sigmar by the dwarves as a gift to humanity. And as a result of being struck in the eye with this sword, Kazarak, then known as Kazarak One-Eye, never had that eye healed, so it often dribbles with blood and pus just because of the magical nature of the runefang. Now, whereas injury in an eye would be a debilitating thing to a beastman, whereby that single disadvantage of depth perception would have people challenging you all the time and eventually kill you and take your clan off you. That's just the way of the beastman. They don't stand for weakness, much like the natural kingdom itself. However, this injury just enraged Kazarak. It made him a far more fearsome opponent. He would sit down any challenger, and eventually people stopped trying because they realized that this had actually made him just an angrier beastman, not a weaker beastman. And so Kazarak, much after he'd taken the injury from Boris, his clan and his war herd had dispersed, began to regroup and repopulate, as the beastmen always tend to do if they're allowed to survive. So he goes about regathering his forces and eventually comes up with a strategy of several elaborate ambushes around Middenland, all of which are done to tempt Boris out of Middenheim, because Middenheim is a fortress. It's hard to break down. You're unlikely to be able to take Middenheim. It has been done, but it's very difficult to do. And I don't think beastmen themselves have ever even come close to taking Middenheim. It's only ever been, I think, a greenskin war that just overwhelmed them with numbers, and the Skaven came close once, but I think that's about it. He needs to lure Boris out, so he eventually does, with all these ambushes, killing the citizens of Middenland. Boris comes out, and this is what his entire new clan has been built to do, to trap Boris Todbringer. And eventually Kazarak catches up with Boris in the heat of the battlefield, throws him from his horse, pins him to the ground, and slowly and deliberately, with the tip of one of his horns, gouges out Boris's right eye. and he takes huge delight in this, sort of laughing manically after he's done it. He lets Boris live because he wants him to live with the shame of having been beaten by Kazarak. And these two have met many times since. They've set their armies against each other many times over the years, and their rivalry is really a rivalry of the ages. It really is a rivalry that defines the age they currently live in the Warhammer world. Now, Boris is set upon killing Kazarak. He wants to have his revenge, but Kazarak's wily and he has the entire Drakworld to hide in. So they fight around each other, and it's even said that Kazarak, with his joy of battle, didn't kill Boris that day that he took his eye, because he actually quite enjoys matching wits with the old general, and it's the only competition Kazarak really has in terms of people matching his martial skill and culling on the battlefield, at least that he's ever encountered in his life wandering the Drakworld. So that's the theory. That's Boris and Kazarak. So Boris at the moment is sitting in Middenheim, despondent but filled with both sadness at his family and his personal losses and the state of his future bloodline, and rage that Kazarak is still alive and allowed to wander the Drakworld. And those are really the two emotions that rule Boris at this point in his life. So he's not probably at his most well-adjusted, but despite that, he's still out there, still leading his troops from the front, and is still a cunning and wily fighter with huge amounts of strength, even for a man as old as 57, which I have to imagine. I imagine he's probably close to 67 now in the current Warhammer timeline, but even that, you have to imagine 67 is unheard of, almost unheard of old age in the Warhammer world for human beings. I don't think healthcare is top of their list of priorities, but who knows? So Boris soldiers on, old man Todbringer, and he keeps fighting the beastmen of the Drakworld and keeping the lands of Middenland safe for his people. Now, we already have Boris in the game. He will definitely be the faction leader for Middenland when they're introduced as an independent faction, but who else could there be? And that's kind of difficult. So I think we're definitely going to have Boris. The second one, I think, will be Arl Ulrich, Emil Valgir, the Ulrich, the head of the cult of Ulrich. He will be very much like a warrior priest, but have more of the warrior priest abilities of a priest of Ulrich rather than a priest of Sigmar, which will be very different, as I covered earlier on in the video. So those two, obviously bonuses for Zealots and the Knights of the White Wolf for the Arl Ulrich, probably bonuses for Knights Panther, and maybe greatswords for Boris, that kind of thing. That's how they distinguish him, the religious head and the military head of Middenland, going sort of fighting side by side. Now, I think they could get a third one in there if they wanted to, and I really hope they do. And this is who I'd actually like to see it be. There are some other people you could get, like the head of the Knights Panther chapters, the Grandmaster of the Knights Panther, or the Grandmaster of the White Wolf. But I don't think they're distinctive enough. They'd be too much like Boris or Arl Ulrich himself. So who I'd actually like to see is Marcus Wolfhart. Now, I covered Marcus Wolfhart, many of you may have seen already, in my Total War Warhammer Missing Legendary Lords Empire Edition video that covered his story. But essentially, Marcus is a Middenlander, born and bred. He was a villager. Village was attacked by a giant. Giant killed everyone. Marcus swears vow of vengeance, starts killing all monsters he can find. That's now his full-time job. Karl Franz hears of this, rewards him with a bow, which is actually made out of Drakworld wood. So Marcus is very much Middenland themed, with his bow made of the wood of the local forest. In fact, he hunts in the Drakworld. He lives almost exclusively in Middenland. So I would think he would be a great third legendary lord for the Middenland faction, and I hope we see him make it, rather than just another Knights Panther or Knights of the White Wolf guy. I think he would make a much more interesting one, and it would be great to give the humans an archery hero. And I imagine his mechanics would work much like the Glade Lords for the Wood Elves, maybe less range or something like that, but I imagine he'd operate very similarly to that. So very much looking forward to seeing Marcus, and also Middenland would present an opportunity to introduce the Huntsman, and of course Marcus is the head of the Huntsman within the entirety of the Empire, not just Middenland. He tends to run all Huntsman units, or be in charge of all Huntsman units within the Empire as a whole. So that would allow them to introduce Huntsman into the game, and I think they would do with Middenland, because that's where Huntsman kind of made their name, hunting the Drakworld, killing beastmen, killing game, killing monsters. That's what they do. So really looking forward to hopefully having Marcus as the other legendary lord. That about sums it up for our Middenland video. It was quite a long one, guys. I hope that was all right with you. Thank you very much for joining me on this one. Do please subscribe for this and more Warhammer videos, as well as videos of other strategy games I'm currently covering on the channel. Do leave a like if you liked it, a comment if there's anything else you'd like to see from Middenland, or anything I maybe missed out that you're keen to discuss with me and the rest of my viewers. as I love having discussions with you guys about stuff that's missing or stuff that we could include in the game. There is a bit of a debate about, there is some more, how do I put this? Imaginative, that's probably the wrong word, but different stuff that's I'm not sure is necessarily canon in Warhammer or has ever really made it onto the tabletop. For example, there's the idea that werewolves are fairly common. Werewolves are common in Norsca. I know that's canon in the lore, but some have put forward the argument that werewolves are relatively common in Middenland, and that maybe that you could have a unit of people that would turn into werewolves. I'm not 100% sure on the canon of that as it relates to the tabletop. Maybe you guys actually know. I've never been able to rectify that in my own mind. So there's the idea of these werewolves possibly being an option for Middenland, and the concept that Middenlanders ride some of the massive wolves that you get in the Drakwold. Now, I'm not 100% sure on the wolf riding thing. I've seen debate on the internet side with both sides of that argument that there are wolf riders in Middenland. And although that would be cool to see, I'm not sure if that's 100% canon. And I hate myself, but maybe they would include it and maybe have them as the Middenland equivalent of demigryphs. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure on that. So that's why I didn't necessarily include it in the body of this video, because I'm just not 100% sure on the, not legality, but legitimacy of the Wolf Riders within the Empire lore as it stands currently, or canon, shall we say. So that's really where we are, guys. There are a couple of things I didn't include. Hopefully I gave the reasons. If there's anything else I've missed, let me know. As I said, do subscribe, leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. And thank you very much for joining me. Have a great day, guys.